arrive at this moment where people say we have to have this conversation about race. We should talk about race as a school. We should talk about race as a city. We should talk about race as a country. And the problem with that is that we don't often put the history of racism in historical perspective and in historical context. And we do this, when we do this, we fail to sort of like, we misdiagnose how we arrived at this moment. And so then when people are like, I don't see color, or I'm, or have these sort of conceptions around race that like don't make any sense, it's because we haven't done the work of arriving here. So for example, part of it is how we're taught about race and racism in high schools. So for example, everybody in this room know who Thomas Jefferson is, right? Everybody talking Thomas Jefferson, we are taught, is the founding father, the intellectual founding father of this country. He is responsible for the conception of the Declaration of Independence. He helped to write the Constitution. He is the sort of paragon of our ideals. He represents the best of our national aspirations, which is true in part, but what's also true, and what I didn't know until years later when I read his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. And in it, he says very explicitly, he says, black people are inherently inferior to white people in both endowments of body and mind. And he says the slave is incapable of love, and the slave is incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. He writes about Phyllis Wheatley, who is largely considered to be the first published African-American poet in the history of the United States. He's like, well, black people don't possess the intellectual or emotional acumen with which to create art. So we can call this something else, but we can't call it poetry because black people do not possess the necessary emotional capacity with which to create beautiful things. And I think about that. And I think about how that's a version of Jefferson that I was never taught. And think about how Jefferson is in many ways a microcosm for the way that we think about America and American history, where we are so committed to the idea of American exceptionalism that we inevitably suppress anything that makes us look unexceptional, right? And Jefferson is just one example. You look back at the Civil Rights Movement, and people talk about the Civil Rights Movement like it was this 3-day festival, right? And they're like, day 1, Rosa sat down on a bus. Day 2, Martin had a dream. Day 3, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were passing out cotton candy. Everybody could vote. They were doing the Dougie Kumbaya, right? And that's like really how a lot of people in our sort of historical American imaginations think about what the Civil Rights Movement was. But what happens is when you make a caricature of an entire movement, you inevitably make a caricature of the people within those movements, right? So Dr. King becomes a sort of caricature of himself, and he becomes this person that people reduce to a single passage in a single section of a single speech on a single day, where he says like little black girls and little black boys and little white girls and little white boys will hold hands and not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And people decontextualize it and use it to sort of push forward their own ideas, even when they run counter to everything else that Dr. King stood for, right? Dr. King also stood against like imperialism and colonialism. He called the United States in his speech in 1967 at the Riverside Church the greatest purveyor of violence in the history of the world. He said the United States has a fundamental responsibility to all the countries that it is responsible for colonizing, right? And that it is necessary that we pay them reparations. He talked about the redistribution of wealth. He talked about the need for universal basic income, for jobs, right? And all of these different things that don't fit neatly into the narrative of who Dr. King was. Or even Rosa Parks, right? We think about Rosa Parks. I remember I was a kid, and the way that Rosa Parks was taught to me, I was like, oh man, Rosa Parks was this like 80-something-year-old old lady, and she was this seamstress, and she was so tired and frail, and like, I can't believe that they made her get up from the bus. But like, Rosa Parks was 42 years old when that happened, right? And she was a 42-year-old activist who knew exactly what she was doing, and she wasn't not getting up because she was tired. She was not getting up because she was tired of racism. She was tired of discrimination. She wasn't like physically frail. The movement and that initiative was like something that had been planned for a long time. And I say that because like now we look back at Martin Luther King and people are like, everybody loves him, he's so great, posting Martin Luther King Day quotes on your Instagram and your Snapchat, he's the best. But back in 1966, if you look back at the Gallup polls, 2/3 of Americans didn't approve of him. They thought he was asking for too much. They thought they didn't like the tactics he was using. They didn't like how he was going about doing things. So what happens when you do that is that you sort of make a caricature again of him, and you have Dr. King, who we sort of mythologize into this person that he actually wasn't. And then when Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, or Black Lives Matter walks across a bridge, people are like, why are they walking across a bridge? This is ridiculous. Dr. King would never do that. He would never allow for people to walk across a bridge during the Civil Rights Movement. That's so ridiculous. It's like the movie Selma just came out. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's literally about civil rights workers walking across a bridge, right? But it's that sort of like ahistorical conception of the civil rights movement and how social change happens that makes it seem that like, oh, everything will just change and be different if we just like all hold hands and walk down the street, but don't block traffic because people will get upset if you block traffic, right? If you just hold hands, walk down the street, sing Kumbaya and do the Dougie, right? And it's like collective, like festoon of Dougginess. But that is not how social change happens, and I think it's really important for people to understand and to unearth and unpack the dynamics of how these things actually happen. And I always give this timeline because I think it's really important. And I think it's really important for understand like how we arrived at this moment and the way that people specifically talk about black people and folks of color, but like the first slaves came to this country in 1619. The Emancipation Proclamation was 1863. Civil War ended in 1865. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were 1964 and 1965. So there's only been 50 years in which black people in this country have even had a semblance of legal and legislative freedom. For 350 years prior to that, it was fundamentally illegal to discriminate against, dehumanize, delegitimize, and disenfranchise black people. Not an interpersonal, somebody being mean and using the N-word, but like you are a state-sanctioned, second-class citizen. So if you kick somebody for 350 years, and then you stop kicking them for a seventh of the amount of time that you spent kicking them, it would be intellectually and morally disingenuous to then look at that group of people and be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have the same academic outcomes? Why don't you have the same economic outcomes? Why don't you have the same political outcomes? Why don't you have why do your communities look that way? Why is there so much violence? Why is there so much poverty? Like, we know the answers to this question, right? But we don't often put it in that perspective. And so people do this thing where like, they fall into the trap of thinking that the reason one part of San Francisco looks one way and another part of San Francisco looks another way, or one part of Oakland looks this way and another part of Oakland looks that way, is somehow reflective of the people in those communities, rather than things that have been done to the people in those communities for generation after generation after generation after generation. Now, if you leave here with one thing, I want you to leave here with that, right? A recognition that like the arc of violence against groups of people in this country is long. And we tell ourselves there's a new museum that opened in Washington, D.C., the African American History and Culture Museum. And the woman who cut the ribbon to open that museum was the daughter of an enslaved person. Right? Like, and we do this thing where people are like, why are you still talking about slavery? That was so long ago. That has nothing to do with this. Let it go. But like the person who opened the museum, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., was the daughter of a slave. And we tell ourselves that these things happened a long, long time ago, but these things didn't happen a long time ago at all. The people in those black and white lynching photos you see, the people who were spitting on the little kids who were trying to integrate the schools, the people who were protesting Dr. King and throwing rocks at him when he was walking through the street, those people are still alive. Those people are still alive, those people are still voting, those people are still in elected positions, like in local, state, and federal government. And so it's really important for y'all to understand that like this history that you read about in your textbooks, or sometimes that you don't read about in your textbooks that you should read about, wasn't a long time ago at all. And so that's a lot talking, but this poem came from a recognition that like complicating history is really important. And what we know is that 12 of our first 18 presidents owned slaves, 8 of them owned slaves while they were in office, and this poem is a letter to 5 of them. Letter to 5 of the presidents who owned slaves while they were in office. George Washington, when you won the revolution, how many of your soldiers did you send from the battlefield to the cotton field? How many had to trade in their rifles for plows? Can you blame the slaves who ran away to fight for the British because at least the redcoats were honest about their oppression? Thomas Jefferson, when you told Sally Hemings that you would free her children if she remained your mistress, did you think there was honor in your ultimatum? Did you think we wouldn't be able to recognize the assault in your signature as raping your slave? You disguise it as bribery, make it less of a crime. When you wrote the Declaration of Independence, did you ever intend for black people to have freedom over their bodies? James Madison. When you wrote to Congress that black people should count as 3/5 of a person, how long did you have to look at your slaves to figure out the math? Was it easy to chop them up? Did you think they'd be happy being more than just half human? James Monroe. When you proposed sending slaves back to Africa, did black bodies feel like rented tools? When you branded them, did the scar on their chest include an expiration date? When you named the country Liberia, were you trying to be ironic? Does this really count as liberation? Andrew Jackson. Was the Trail of Tears not enough for you? Was killing Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminoles not enough to quench your imperialism? How many brown bodies do you have to bulldoze before you can call it progress, Mr. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson? When you put your hand on the Bible and swore to protect this country, let's be honest in who you were talking about. When the first Independence Day fireworks set the sky aflame, don't forget where we were watching from. So when you remember Jefferson's genius, don't forget the slaves who built the bookshelves in his library. When you remember Jackson's victories in war, don't forget what he was fighting to preserve. When you sing that this country was founded on freedom, don't forget the duet of shackles dragging against the ground my entire life. I've been taught how perfect this country was, but no one ever told me about the pages torn out of my textbooks, how black and brown bodies have been bludgeoned for 3 centuries and find no place in the curriculum. Oppression doesn't disappear just because you decided not to teach us that chapter. If you only hear one side of the story, at some point you have to question who the writer is. And so this is my book. Came out about 18 months ago or so. And in it, it's really thinking about, it's sort of like a coming of age book, and like thinking about, again, that idea of how you grow up in a home in which you feel loved, affirmed, and celebrated, and then go out into a world that like projects their own fear onto you and who you are. I'm reading something that's sort of like a change of pace. And so one of the things like about this book is that you have to like dig deep and try to explore like, you know, the parts of yourself that you've long tried to ignore or like push to the side. And for me, one of the things that I was most ashamed of as a child was the fact that I was not good at basketball. And like, as a black kid in New Orleans, the fact that I wasn't good at basketball like caused me a lot of anxiety. And so my boys would like go to the park and everybody would be like, let's play ball. And I'd be like, we could play ball, or we could go watch that new Star Wars movie. And they'd be like, boo, you're whack. And I'm like, oh man, come on guys, Star Wars is great. And I was always the kid who was picked like toward the end of the basketball team, but you can tell like who the not good basketball players are because they're always the ones who are like I hustle really hard, or I'm great at rebounding, right? If somebody says I'm great at rebounding, you know it's a wrap. They're trash. Don't pick them, right? And so I was the kid who was like, I'm really good at rebounding. I'm gonna work really hard. I'm gonna give you everything I have. I'm really loyal. And like all of these things are a great quality for a friend, but like not necessarily somebody you want on your basketball team. So this is a poem that's reminiscing on the reality of my jump shot. My jump shot be all elbow and no wrist. My jump shot be asking what a follow through is. My jump shot be hard to look at. My jump shot be Medusa. My jump shot be the leftovers you don't really want to eat. My jump shot be the fridge that don't work. My jump shot be the sour milk in your cereal. My jump shot be getting picked last by all the other jump shots. My jump shot be old spaghetti. My jump shot be gluten-free. Shout out to the gluten-free people though, I know it's hard. Bread is delicious. It's like, damn. My jump shot be Michael Jordan when he was 7. My jump shot be spending too much time in the library. My jump shot be making everybody else feel better about their jump shot. My jump shot be asking why we didn't stick to soccer. My jump shot be code switching. My jump shot be making people nervous just because it's a jump shot. My jump shot be the only jump shot in class. My jump shot be getting asked to speak on behalf of all the other jump shots. My jump shot be wondering why people think all jump shots are the same. My jump shot be explaining how jump shots come in all shapes and sizes. My jump shot be sounding like it's talking about snowflakes. My jump shot be a snowflake. My jump shot be a home. My jump shot be the only jump shot I've ever had.